Mercedes did not scramble because Russell's tires lasted longer. Mercedes scrambled because the data made that tire life look impossible to ignore. Too calm on traction. Too stable under braking. Too gentle through the stint. Too consistent when Red Bull expected the Mercedes to collapse. And in Formula 1, tire degradation is not a small detail. It is the hidden truth of the entire car. Because one clean stint can be driver management. One perfect setup can be explained. But when a car appears to protect its tires far better than expected, while still keeping race-winning pace, the paddock starts asking the question Mercedes fears most. Was this legal genius, or did the FIA expose a tire trick that went too far? And if the advantage was illegal, Mercedes faces a scandal. But if the trick was legal, the rest of the grid has an even bigger problem. Because tire life controls strategy. Tire life controls pressure. Tire life controls the final laps. And if Russell's Mercedes really found a way to make degradation dramatically better, then Austria was not just a win. It was a warning that Mercedes may have discovered the quietest weapon in Formula 1. Subscribe to the channel. At first, Mercedes could explain Russell's tire life in the safest possible way. Good management. Clean driving. Smart setup. A car finally sitting in the right window. That is the version every team wants people to believe after a race where the tires look unusually strong. Because if the answer is driver management, the threat feels human. If the answer is setup, the threat feels temporary. If the answer is track conditions, the threat can disappear at the next Grand Prix. But the alarming part was not simply that Russell looked after his tires. The alarming part was that the Mercedes appeared to keep the tires alive while still producing the pace to win. That is the detail Red Bull would not ignore. Because in Formula 1, tire life is supposed to cost something. If a driver protects the tires too much, lap time usually suffers. If a car pushes hard, degradation usually arrives later. If the rear tires are abused on traction, the driver pays for it through the stint. If the fronts are overloaded under braking, the car starts losing bite. There is always a trade-off. That is why Russell's data would have become so important. Red Bull would not only ask whether the Mercedes was fast. They would ask how it was staying fast. Was Russell lifting earlier? Was he sacrificing entry speed? Was he protecting the rear by giving up exit? Was the car simply less aggressive? Or was the Mercedes somehow giving him tire life without forcing the usual compromise? That is where the story becomes dangerous. Because a car that is slow and gentle on tires is not frightening. A car that is fast and destroys tires is manageable. But a car that is fast and gentle on tires can control a race. That is the kind of car that changes strategy before the pit wall even makes a call. It can extend a stint. It can defend longer. It can attack later. It can force rivals into awkward stop windows. It can make a driver look calm while everyone else is quietly losing grip. That is why tire degradation is one of the most powerful weapons in Formula 1. It is not loud. It does not always create a dramatic overtake. It does not always appear in the first few laps. It waits. Then it reveals who really has control. And if Russell's Mercedes was losing performance far more slowly than Red Bull expected, then Austria was not just a clean win. It was a technical warning. Because degradation is not isolated. It is connected to the entire car. The rear stability. The front load. The balance on entry. The traction on exit. The way the aerodynamic platform holds itself. The way the driver can apply throttle without sliding. The way the energy is deployed through the lap. The way the car behaves when fuel burns off and the tires are no longer fresh. All of that lives inside the tire data. That is why the FIA angle becomes so tense. If the data showed something outside the regulations, Mercedes would be in serious trouble. Because tire performance is not an area where teams are allowed to do whatever they want. There are rules. There are procedures. There are limits. And if a team finds a method that steps beyond those limits, the advantage can become illegal very quickly. But if the data looked alarming without proving a rule breach, the story becomes much harder for Red Bull. Because then Mercedes may have found a legal way to treat the tires better. And legal tire life is one of the hardest advantages to fight. You cannot protest it away. You cannot demand that a rival's tires degrade faster. You cannot ask the FIA to punish efficiency if the method is inside the rules. You have to beat it. And beating tire life is brutally difficult. Because tire life is not one part. It is not one switch. It is not one visible piece that can be copied from a photograph. It is a relationship between the whole car and the track. A calmer rear means less sliding. Less sliding means less heat. Less heat means the tire surface survives longer. A more stable front means the driver does not overload the tire on entry. A better balance means Russell does not need to fight the steering wheel. Cleaner traction means the car accelerates without tearing the rubber apart. And suddenly, the Mercedes is not just saving tires. It is saving the race. That is what would make Red Bull uncomfortable. Because they know how one tire advantage can create 5 race advantages. Better degradation gives Russell more laps before stopping. More laps before stopping gives Mercedes more strategic choices. More strategic choices force Red Bull to cover moves instead of making their own. Covering moves creates pressure. Pressure creates mistakes. And mistakes turn a small tire advantage into a result. That is why this story is bigger than one set of tires. It is about control. Control of the stint. Control of the pit window. Control of the pace. Control of Verstappen's options. Control of the race itself. If Mercedes has that, Red Bull has to respond immediately. Because the first time it happens, people call it a good race. The second time, they call it a trend. The third time, they call it a problem. And by then, the points are already gone. That is why the claim of a tire trick is so explosive. A tire trick suggests there is a reason the Mercedes was not degrading normally. Maybe it is a clever setup direction. Maybe it is a suspension behavior that keeps the tire loaded more gently. Maybe it is aerodynamic stability that prevents sliding. Maybe it is a preparation method rivals do not fully understand. Maybe it is something the FIA would need to examine closely. But the question that matters most is not whether the word trick sounds dramatic. The question is whether it crosses the line. Because Formula One teams are always looking for tricks. Legal tricks. Clever tricks. Gray area tricks. Tiny discoveries that make the car behave differently. The sport is built on that. But once a trick touches restricted areas, once it manipulates performance in a way the rules do not allow, the story changes instantly. Then Mercedes is no longer defending innovation. Mercedes is defending legality. And that is a much more dangerous fight. Because legality is not about confidence. It is about proof. The FIA has to look at what happened. The team has to explain the method. Rivals want clarity. The paddock wants a boundary. And Russell's win becomes attached to a question that no driver wants near his name. Was the tire life earned, or created by something the car should not have had? That is the uncomfortable position Russell would be in. Because from the cockpit, he may have done everything right. He may have managed the stint perfectly. He may have hit every target. He may have protected the tires with precision. He may have delivered exactly the race Mercedes asked him to drive. But when the car's data becomes controversial, the driver gets pulled into the storm. That is the brutal reality of Formula One. The driver wins with the car. The driver is questioned with the car. The driver celebrates with the car. And if the car becomes suspicious, the victory no longer feels simple. Mercedes would fight that hard. They would want the story to be about execution, about balance, about development, about Russell's control, about a car finally working in the correct window. They would not want the story to become a tire trick exposed by the FIA. Because once that phrase enters the conversation, every future Mercedes stint is watched differently. If Russell saves the tires again, people ask whether the same advantage is still there. If Mercedes suddenly loses that tire life, people ask what changed. If the FIA checks procedures, the suspicion grows. If Red Bull complains again, the pressure multiplies. That is how a technical question turns into a season-long shadow. And Mercedes knows it. Because tire performance is the kind of advantage rivals hate most. It is invisible until it hurts you. You do not always lose to it in one corner. You lose to it slowly. Lap by lap. Your tires slide more. Your pace drops sooner. Your strategy window shrinks. Your driver starts asking for grip. Your pit wall begins defending instead of attacking. And across the garage, the rival looks calm. That is why a dramatic degradation advantage would be so frightening. It would not just mean Russell had a better race. It would mean Mercedes had a way to make the race come toward them. And when a car can make the race come toward it, everything changes. The driver can wait. The pit wall can delay. The team can choose. The rival has to guess. That is the difference between reacting and controlling. Red Bull wants to control. Mercedes wants to take that control away. And tire life is one of the cleanest ways to do it. That is why this first block matters. Because the real story is not just whether Russell's tires lasted longer. The real story is why. If the answer is legal, Mercedes has found a weapon. If the answer is illegal, Mercedes has a crisis. If the answer is unclear, the paddock has a controversy. And all three outcomes are dangerous. A legal weapon threatens Red Bull. An illegal method threatens Mercedes. An unclear method threatens the FIA's authority. That is why the data becomes the center of everything. Not the headline. Not the accusation. Not even the win. The data. Because the data shows whether the car was sliding. Whether the tires were overheating. Whether the pace was fading. Whether the stint followed a normal curve. Whether Russell was protecting performance through driving, or whether the car itself was giving him a level of protection rivals could not explain. That distinction matters. A driver saving tires is impressive. A car saving tires while staying fast is dangerous. A car saving tires through a questionable method is explosive. That is the ladder this story climbs. And each step makes Mercedes' situation more intense. At the bottom, Russell simply drove well. In the middle, Mercedes found a legal tire advantage. At the top, the FIA exposed something the rules cannot allow. That is why the audience has to care about the next detail. Because the next detail changes who is really in trouble. If the FIA found an illegal tire trick, Mercedes is in the firing line. But if the FIA only exposed how effective the Mercedes tire advantage really was, and that advantage survives scrutiny, then Red Bull is the team under pressure. Because then Russell's car has shown the one thing every rival fears. A way to keep speed alive when everyone else is losing it. That is the quietest form of domination. No dramatic smoke. No wild overtake needed. Just a car that asks less from its tires, keeps more performance in reserve, and slowly turns the race into a trap. That is what Austria may have revealed. Not just a Mercedes win. A Mercedes method. And if that method can repeat, then the rest of the grid has a problem much bigger than one Grand Prix. Because tire life does not just win one race. Tire life changes how every race is fought. The next layer is where the tire story becomes more dangerous than the win itself. Because a race win can be explained by many things. Track position. Clean air. Strategy. A strong opening stint. A mistake from a rival. A driver having one of those days where every decision feels perfect. But tire degradation tells a deeper story. It reveals whether the car is only fast for a moment, or whether it can keep being fast when the race starts hurting everyone else. That is why Red Bull would not only look at Russell's lap times. They would look at how those lap times aged. Did the Mercedes lose pace normally? Did the rear tires start to slide? Did the fronts begin to fade under braking? Did Russell have to back out of the throttle? Did the car become nervous as the stint grew longer? Or did the Mercedes keep producing usable pace when the tires should have been asking for mercy? That is the question that makes this so alarming. Because degradation is supposed to expose weakness. It is supposed to reveal which car is working too hard. It is supposed to punish sliding, overheating, poor balance, and aggressive traction. But if Russell's Mercedes avoided that punishment, or avoided far more of it than Red Bull expected, then the race becomes a technical warning. Not just, Mercedes won. Something much sharper. Mercedes may have found a way to keep the tires alive while still staying fast. And that is one of the most valuable advantages in Formula 1. Because tire life changes everything before the viewers even notice. It changes the pit wall. It changes the driver's voice on the radio. It changes how early rivals stop. It changes whether a team can attack at the end of a stint. It changes whether a driver is defending desperately or waiting patiently. A car with tire life does not need to panic. It can let the race come to it. That is what would scare Red Bull most. If Russell's car was only fast at the start, they could pressure it later. If the Mercedes needed clean air to survive, they could attack with strategy. If the tires faded after a few laps, Verstappen could wait. But if Russell's tires stayed alive, then waiting became dangerous. Because every lap Red Bull waited, Mercedes gained more control. That is the hidden power of degradation. It turns time into a weapon. The longer the stint goes, the more the tire-friendly car becomes dangerous. The rival starts calculating. Do we pit now? Do we stay out? Do we cover Mercedes? Do we force them to react? Do we risk track position? Do we protect our own tires? Every option has a cost. And that is how Mercedes could use tire life to create pressure without even overtaking on track. That is why a tire trick allegation is so explosive. Because if a team has found a legal way to protect the tires, it changes the entire strategic map. But if a team has found an illegal way to do it, the win becomes deeply controversial. The difference is massive. Legal tire management is genius. Illegal tire manipulation is a scandal. And the FIA is the only body that can draw that line. That is where Mercedes would begin scrambling. Not necessarily because guilt has been proven, but because the moment the FIA and the tire data enter the same sentence, the team has to protect the meaning of the win. They have to show that Russell's degradation was the result of legal performance.